So Peter,
Yes.
what is the future of journalism? The future of journalism is?
The future of journalism is like the future of our communities in that it will be written by unofficial actors.
Great, tell us more.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. I work with cities. I work with cities that are trying to become more vibrant and sustainable economically, that are trying to attract and retain more talent, and trying to become more satisfying to the people that actually live there. I work with the major stakeholders in cities. I work with local government, chambers of commerce, economic development organizations, arts councils, community foundations. And almost inevitably, I work with the local media on some level as well. Because every place has a story and a narrative. And most every place has something about that narrative that they would actually like to change. And when I come in, I talk with them about changing that narrative sort of from the grassroots up, about the emotional engagement that people have with their places, about becoming a more lovable city, about becoming more engaged, having more engaged citizens emotionally, and becoming a more engaging city emotionally as well. Now, in that narrative that every city has, there's always something that they would like to change about that narrative. And usually that conversation doesn't necessarily talk about narrative and story as we've discussed here today. They usually disguise it in terms of branding and marketing and advertising. But it is story nonetheless that they are talking about. And in trying to change that story, they want to rely upon the tools that they're sort of comfortable with and familiar with. And a lot of that has to do with advertising and marketing. And I can't tell you how many cities think that they are just one great advertising campaign away from their former glory. And many of them also think that they are just one really cool viral video away from changing the game for them. And that's really not the case. But what I've done is I've come up with about 10 things that I tell cities that I work with. Says, here's 10 things you really need to think about in terms of moving and building communities in this digital age where social media is becoming so very, very important. So let's get started. You would not believe how many cities actually still don't think they need to be on Facebook or on Twitter. You know, I actually have to go in and convince these people that this is something that's kind of important. 800 million Facebook users, 200 million Twitter users by the end of the year. By the way, 800 million folks on Facebook, 350 million of them are accessing Facebook through a mobile device. Think about that. Now, you wouldn't think that I'd have to make the case, but so many cities and politicians, government and official organizations, they've seen too many of the Anthony Weiner examples. And it's going to be a funny joke for many, many years to come. But that's kind of the case. We have to get over that. And I say, look, if you're going to be part of this 21st century conversation, you actually have to be there. Do I know what the future of Facebook and Twitter is? Absolutely not. But I do know this. If you're going to be part of, if you want to be part of the solution, if you want to figure out where these things are going, you actually have to be in the game. You have to be using the tool. So I tell them, hey, look, I know this makes you nervous, but as the old adage goes, fake it till you make it, until you actually figure out what you're going to do with this stuff. But you've got to be here if you want to be part of the conversation. Social media is how young professionals communicate. And actually, I've revised this because it's actually more true. Social media is how young people communicate. Now, every city is actually trying to attract and retain more of their young talent, as it were. The challenge is that they speak a different language than we do. If you're over 30, and this is actually a pretty good mix here. We got, I'm sure, a lot of people under 30 and a lot of folks over 30. Clay Shirky, the author, actually divides us into digital natives and digital immigrants. If you're over 30, like me, you are a digital immigrant. We remember when there were 3 television stations. We remember rotary phones, we bought albums, we bought cassettes. If you're under 30, you've grown up with an internet that's always been there. You never bought an album in that same sense unless you're sort of one of those retro hipsters who think vinyl sounds better. Okay, I get that. But for the most part, the digital natives are very different in the way they deal with this technology. Have you noticed how, if you're a parent and maybe your kids or maybe yourselves, you notice that the digital natives, they don't answer their phone. They don't like voice communications quite so much. And email usage is going way down amongst this cohort. Any of you got your kids on the phone? Try calling them right now. What happens? It goes right to voicemail, right? But you text them, you get an almost instantaneous response. Like, how the hell did they respond that quickly? It just goes to show sort of where this is going. Everyone wants to talk to these young professionals and these young people. Well, if you want to talk to them, you got to go to where they live, and they live on social media. Number 3. Social media is a new threshold capability. It's a new threshold capability for cities. It's a new threshold capability for organizations, threshold capability for people. How many of you remember when the web sort of first broke, about 1994, 95, 96? Yeah, I'm old enough to remember that. We had to learn new tools and a new language and new stuff. And how many of you remember the debate, maybe within your own organization, of businesses saying, I'm not quite sure we want to let our folks have internet access at their desktop, right? You remember that? Yeah. We kind of got over that. We realized that was too important. But I tell you, I hear this all the time from cities and organizations saying, well, we don't really want, we don't allow access to social media for our employees. And I think this is just a huge mistake. You've got to let them play with this tool to get comfortable in this arena in order for them to get past that sort of initial fascination that we have with, ooh, checking out what's on Farmville today. What's my buddy Ken doing on Facebook? We get over that, and then we actually start treating it very much as a tool. And it is this new threshold capability. Number 4, this is important. Social media is social capital building. Now, many of you may know Robert Putnam's book called Bowling Alone. It came out in 2000, and it talked about the value of the social connections that we have to each other, and he called it social capital. Now, many people decried the internet as being one of the precipitating factors for the decline in social capital, and they said they have friends on Facebook instead of having friends in real life. Well, it's a nice sort of phrase, it's very catchy and whatnot, but it turns out that friends on Facebook actually matter. In these areas of emerging neuroscience, neuropsychology, neuroeconomics, they've actually studied how the brain interprets behaviors and things like that. And a guy out of California by the name of Dr. Paul Zak, they call him the Love Doctor, which is a pretty cool title actually. He's done this whole study around oxytocin. And oxytocin is the hormone in your brain that is most closely associated with affection and cuddling and all that kind of good stuff. It's the love hormone and whatnot. He did an experiment a little over a year ago. It was actually documented in Fast Company magazine, where he had people interact with their friends, measure the levels of oxytocin, then he had them interact with their friends via social media, measure the levels of oxytocin. Guess what? The brain treated those interactions, virtual and physical, as the same. We had the same sort of reaction to that, the same amounts of oxytocin were being produced in our brains. Now, clearly, I think there is an age bias in this, that the digital natives probably find that those sort of virtual interactions satisfying in a way that maybe some of us digital immigrants don't. Nonetheless, the data is there that our brains treat these virtual interactions as satisfying. So in this sense, that social media is social capital building, and that's really, really important to think about. Number 5, so in this, social media volume now becomes something that we should actually measure and pay attention to as sort of an area of overall community health and vitality. On a very basic level, what we could do is we could actually be looking at how many people like us on Facebook. I mean, that's sort of a simple measure, but it actually says something, because if somebody likes you, that's a public declaration of affection. If I click that I like the Poynter Institute, yes, it shows up as a like on the Poynter Institute, but it also shows up on my page. It says Peter Kageyama likes the Poynter Institute, a public display of affection. So I can't secretly like something. I've actually got to sort of obviously like it. So there is that kind of measurement. But I think it's actually more important to think about this in a bigger way. And my friend Richard Florida, he just recently published this in The Atlantic, and I had to write this down because it's a good quote. He said, human progress to a large degree has depended upon the continual expansion of social networks which enable faster sharing and shaping of ideas. And humanity's greatest social innovation remains the city. As our cities have grown larger, the synapses that connect them, people with exceptional social skills, are becoming ever more essential to economic growth. Now think about that. If we're talking about folks who are using social media as basically the synapses in the collective brain that makes up our communities, and we're enabling that with these tools and technology that is social media, which is essentially synapses on steroids, that becomes really important. And by the way, if you actually want to track sort of social media volume in your city, Facebook has a pretty cool little tool in their advertising section. It's called their reach metric. If you want to advertise on Facebook and say, well, how many people would I reach if I wanted to actually do a little ad run for St. Petersburg, Florida? And you type in St. Pete, and it'll tell you how many folks are reached by that. It's something that the newspapers have done for a long period of time as well. But it's a kind of useful tool if you actually want to sort of measure that over time and look at how many people are essentially using social media and talking about that in your community. Number 6, you can't use the same message as you did with other media. Going back to that first website that we all sort of sweated over, how many of you remember the first time we did a website, somebody said, take some of that copy that we did for our brochure and put that on the web. How'd that work out? Not so good. We realized that we don't read the same way online as we do in print. Well, you would think that because it is on a computer, that social media would actually be more akin to a website. It's really not. It's actually another step further away from true reading. I mean, we don't really read online. We have this sort of skimming, sort of sorting kind of thing that we do. So the trick is you can't use that same message as before. And that's been highly problematic because folks used to make a living sweating over this florid copy, you know, about the city and all this other kind of stuff and all the ad copy. Now it's down to 140 characters, a character. And then when people freak out when I say, by the way, a space is a character. You know, the folks who are saying no to Twitter, they don't realize it's 140 characters. A lot of them think it's 140 words. No, it's 140 characters. We don't believe advertising, but we do believe our networks. We are the most over-marketed to generation ever. We see thousands of marketing messages every day, and we believe almost none of them. Almost none of them. That isn't to say that advertising is not valuable. I do think it serves an incredibly important purpose at the most basic level, is that it drives awareness. I would love to see an ad campaign for a city that simply said, consider St. Petersburg, www.stpete.com. Leave it at that. Because in this day and age, you know, it doesn't matter really what you're saying on that website or in that brochure and all that stuff, because frankly, I don't believe you. I mean, it's your job to say this. I mean, every mayor in America, every chamber of commerce in America is saying that our city is the greatest city for live, work, and play. Bring your business, bring your family. Come on, it's all great. It's a complete non-message. So, in this day and age, what happens when we hear something about consider St. Petersburg? What do? We go to Google. And in this day and age, you are who Google says you are. I don't care about all the other language and all the other stuff that you're sweating in terms of copy. You are who Google says you are. So that becomes a total different game changer in terms of how we think about all of this marketing and advertising that we do. Now, who do we believe? We believe our friends. When my friend Ken says, hey man, you should check out this new restaurant, or this new album, this new band, they're great. Or somebody says, hey man, St. Pete is blowing up, you need to get down here. I would tend to listen to that. I would pay more attention to that because I have a context. And that's how some of this actually, you know, starts to happen. We don't believe advertising, but we do believe each other. Number 8, social media is about unofficial messages, unofficial messages and unofficial messengers. And this is the one that drives folks crazy. Drives cities crazy, drives newspapers, media, all this stuff. It drives them crazy. Because for the longest time we have existed in this world where messages were tightly controlled and messengers were the ones that we had officially designated. You know, the PR, the spokesperson and things like that. We were able to push them out in front of something, says this is the person you talk to and this is the official message and yet, you know, and you never get to see any of the other kind of stuff, right? The command and control sort of mentality around messaging. Well, social media and all the empowerment has happened and totally changes the game. And now, all of a sudden, all of these unofficial messengers are taking sort of what we were saying, taking it and blowing it out to their networks, changing it, modifying it, interpreting it, commenting on it, and all of a sudden now, we have lost total control of what started out as a fairly simple message. Yet that is actually the power, potentially, of these networks. I think it's only when we start embracing the fact that we really don't have the control that we can actually start using that to our advantage. Too many folks still want to try to manage their social networks and things like that. And that's when I think they run into trouble. When they start trying to control the people who are not really used to having that control sort of mentality. In fact, that's probably creates a more negative experience with those folks and those bloggers and things like that because they don't like that. There's a reason why they are not operating within the establishment. So that becomes part of how we need to think about this. Letting go. Someone said earlier today about the power of letting go. And that's very, very true in this particular environment. Number 9, social media is a power law distribution, which is a cool, fancy term for what is best described by Wikipedia. All of us here probably used Wikipedia, right? Show of hands. How many people here have made a Wikipedia entry? Okay, a few. How many people have made more than 5? 2. Okay. This is a pretty smart crowd, so I'm guessing that's actually a little bit higher than the norm. Did you know that all of that content, tens of millions of hours of man hours to create the content that is all of Wikipedia, was done by less than 1% of all of the users of Wikipedia? All of us are basically sponges. We sort of, we're parasites on Wikipedia. We take, but we don't necessarily give back. Less than 1% of the users have actually given back and created that content. And of that 1%, there's a very small number of that 1% who do a ton of work. They're the ones who did not only 5, they maybe do 500 or 5,000 entries because that's something that they groove on. They want to do that kind of thing. It's pretty amazing. A few of us maybe make an entry or two here and there, and then the rest of us just consume. Now, actually, physical cities, I think, follow that same sort of pattern, that there is a small number of people who do an extraordinary amount for creating the content that is our community and our city. And the rest of us, well, we consume, and there's nothing wrong with that. in return we pay our taxes, we obey the law, and we spend our money. But when you start thinking about this in the context of how social media and communications goes, it doesn't have to be talking to everybody. And that was sort of the mentality that we used to have when broadcast seemed to work, right? We put this message out to everybody. Now, in this world, it's about talking to the people who talk prolifically. It is talking about that 1% who are out there blogging and tweeting and doing these things on an epic sort of scale and getting them, in turn, to take your message and sort of run with that. So there's something about that that's pretty interesting. And number 10, the web is dead. This was the cover of Wired magazine in September of last year. And it was actually a fascinating article because they were looking at the nature of internet traffic as it has evolved over the last, well, essentially 20 years. And if you look back to the early days, I was talking about this with some woman before earlier today. We're talking about the early days of the internet when, it was Telnet and Gopher and these weird things and all of these things before a web browser. And if you track this, really the important one to look at is this red one down here at the bottom. That's sort of web traffic as we typically know it. And that's surfing the web. That is essentially sitting in front of a computer or a laptop and, chasing information via a website. And you look, and it peaks somewhere around 2000, 2001, and it is now precipitously declining down here. Interesting. We no longer sort of have that mentality where we want to sit in front of a computer and a website, or excuse me, in front of a browser and sort of search for information. Where's all that traffic going? It's going to our phones. And that's sort of how we're absorbing information. And you see this corresponding rise in video. And we were talking earlier today about the importance of a video channel and things like that. While social media is highly text-based at this particular point, there's this corresponding rise in the importance of video and video storytelling. How do you create that compelling, YouTube moment that could potentially, become shareable? Not going to use the V word, but could become shareable and things like that. So there's a new skill set that is going along with that. And I think this is a fascinating, idea because so much of the way we think about websites now still remains this idea of surfing the web, which was born 15 years ago. We really don't surf the web anymore. But think about how much of our marketing and the way we approach this is still based around that particular paradigm. And a final thought. Cities are a shared story. They're a story that we all create every day. We're co-creators in that particular process. And the stories that we remember are the stories that connect with us on an emotional level. Those are the ones that matter to us. And it was interesting that twice today, the story of that Darth Vader commercial with Volkswagen and the little kid was brought up. And you're right, it's a wonderful commercial. I'm sorry, but that commercial cannot hold a candle to that Chrysler imported from Detroit ad that ran in that same Super Bowl. How many of you remember that? Yeah. When Eminem turns to the camera and says, "We're the Motor City, and this is what we do," I could have wept. In that moment, we were all Detroiters. There was something about that resonated with all of us, and that is the power of story, and that is the power of that emotional content. The future of our cities requires better stories and more storytellers, and for all of us, all of our cities, to become more shareable stories as we move forward. Thank you very much.